Welcome to This Old App, a podcast about learning, coding, smashing stuff together, breaking things apart, startups, failing, winning, and any other buzzwords we can think of.
Hey, Randy, what have you been up to?
Let's see. I've been doing a lot of coding personally, but let's talk about our podcast. We have on CTO Think, our other podcast, we interviewed Greg Pollock, who kind of goes way back in my coding history. He is the founder of Code School, which was later bought by Pluralsight. But his tutorials are where a good chunk of developers that have been in the business like 15 years, I think there's a good number of developers that were introduced to new web-based technologies through the Code School content.
For sure.
And now Greg has focused and invested his time into Vue.js, which is one of the alternative frameworks, going up against Angular, React, and such. And we talked to him at length about not just why he's betting on Vue, but also like how he succeeded in marketing his tutorials. And, he had a lot of great content related for someone that's either wanting to do tutorials themselves as a business or trying to launch a product, because he's done it 2 or 3 times and he's run a consultancy. He's got a lot of experience in this industry that I think is really relevant. So that was a show we just published.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that one. As I said at the end of that particular episode, the episode ended up turning into a Greg Pollock fan club.
Totally.
But I am. He's here local to Orlando. He's been a central part of the tech community for as long as I have. And as somebody I've always admired the work he's done. So I was thrilled to have him on. I thought we had a great discussion. And it's good for people to just listen to. And it fits a lot of what we're doing because we're starting to put our toe in the water on tutorials as well. I'm sitting here with with a gray backdrop next to me because I've been practicing videos.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's worthwhile for everyone to listen to, and I would guess a good number of our audience has at some point seen a Code School video of some kind, just because It was really good, well done content, and I can only hope that we can get to that point. Sure. Other than in terms of projects, I've been really still focused Firebase, React Native. Firebase has been a really big focus, a little bit of Rails work for a client. And tomorrow I'm going to end up being a substitute teacher for a boot camp. So kind of my usual schedule this summer is what I've been doing. What about you?
So last week went out to Colorado, up in the Rockies, Keystone Resort, for a conference given by Instructure. That is the company that produces the Canvas LMS, which is what Aspire EDU has a lot of clients that use that LMS. So it's always a good time. We always pull everybody in the company together. So it's kind of our annual retreat as well as that conference. This year we did something slightly different. I've not done a good job of communicating with Instructure technical staff, technical leadership in the past. This year we sought them out. We went to their sessions. We engaged them as much as we could so that we could find out what they're doing, how what we're doing is impacting them, because we hammer their APIs every night for the data we need. And it was funny. I was talking to the VP of engineering, and his statement was, "Oh, you guys are the ones that we removed the threshold for." So right there, I was like, "Yeah, you know who we are." So the reason they remove that threshold is we provide such a good service to the clients, and it's a good complementary service to what their product does as well. But we had some good discussions about the future. They've got something called live events, which is kind of I think it's a push of data, and I have to look to see what technology they're using, but it's a push of data every time an event happens. So
WebSockets. It's gonna be like
there you go. Yeah. There you go. WebSockets. So they do a push if a student does participates in a discussion, posts a discussion, it'll send something. It'll send something through so that we can pick it up. The only thing it's using SQSQ. That's the acronym I was trying to remember. And the only reason we haven't started to use that, because that's really the overnight work we do on the API, is a lot of looking for those discussion posts so that we can, and we're not reading the discussion posts. We're looking, did the student make one? We throw away all the content in it. We're looking for the timestamp, really. So the only problem we have with the live events is they have in their documentation, it says there are circumstances where the event will not get queued.
Yeah.
And so we read that as, okay, so you're telling us that it's not guaranteed that the data is there, whereas API, the data is pretty much guaranteed. So I've asked them to clarify that, if that means that if they push an event and it doesn't get queued, does that mean it's gone forever? Or does that mean they'll get it next time they push something? Because if it's next time they push something, then that's fine. We don't need it real time. We just need the data.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. Go ahead.
Well, I know that, I mean, even a lot of firms try to say that because there's an error of messages getting lost. And I guess the question is always, how urgent do you need it? I mean, personally, to me, it's more of like, just send me a message when I need to update by the API, and then I'll trigger, instead of long polling at a set rate, I will just have something that gets a message saying you need to update, and then I hit the API instead of expecting the data to come through on the message. You know, that's why I've seen that less. I've seen more of like, subscribe to know when you should poll us, not instead of pinging us every 5 seconds, which is kind of costly for a firm providing data. That's what I would think.
Right. And we would be more than happy to just look every hour. Like I said, we don't need to know the minute they do it. We just know that they did it. Currently we're hitting the API, and I tell you, that's probably at least half our load is looking for those discussion posts. So if we spread those out throughout the day instead of doing it overnight when we're doing everything else, our lives would be simpler, and B, we'd be hammering their hardware less. So I think they'd appreciate that. So that was one aspect. The other aspect is they're starting to dive into GraphQL. And real briefly, and for those out there that know GraphQL, this is going to be probably 90% wrong. But GraphQL is essentially an API. I'm going to say it's a targeted API. So what you can do is you can make a query. That's what GraphQL means. It's a query language. You can make a query for the data you want, as opposed to just hitting an endpoint. Usually when you hit an API, you'll hit an endpoint, and you might be able to tag on some attributes to it to filter a bit more what you're looking for. GraphQL is a bit more targeted, to where you can go out there, hit the endpoint, say, give it the query language, and it gives you a much more targeted result.
Let me interject here with, let me give some context to the listener on what you'd mean by endpoint. So if you're setting up an API, traditionally for the last decade, I'd say, if you were setting up if you had, let's say you had an application with data that people want to get to, in your case, they are a specific school that wants to pull data related to their classrooms and students. You would set up an API so that their side, their computer system could reach out with an HTTP call and hit what we call an endpoint, which is really just a URL with some other security measures and stuff around it to say, hey, I want this updated student data. And the approach that we've been using, the pattern, is called REST. And so I don't even want to get into what it means. It's just REST, RESTful. Some people call it RESTful type of API structure. And the idea is that it's kind of like follows this CRUD pattern: create, read, update, delete. And you create these endpoints using different methods: get, post, put for updates, delete for destroy. And essentially, people can interact with your API using these RESTful endpoints. But what happens is, over time, as things scale, different companies want different data. They don't need all the data you send back. That's one problem. They're constantly hitting you for maybe 2 or 3 fields, but they get everything back. So that's actually inefficient along the pipeline, both on speed and on bandwidth. And then the other thing is that you, the provider, deal with these issues where the CRUD structure isn't exactly what has to happen. You have these kind of one-off queries that people just like, I just need to hit this. I just need to know in the last hour how many changes happened. And you're like, we don't really have a really efficient REST pattern for that one specific endpoint. So then you start creating these edge case endpoints. And now you're basically managing, as a company, your API over time with all these edge case endpoints that don't actually follow the RESTful pattern, and you have to document all of them. And that's the other thing.
Right.
So GraphQL is coming in and saying, because everybody comes in to hitting endpoints and maintaining endpoints with all these various needs, let's just make it flexible so that the user can just specify what they want and need, and your system is flexible and sends back only what they need and only the actions they need to do. So GraphQL is trying to go from this rigid, RESTful pattern to a more flexible, take what you want when you need it, that we give you access to. That's how I've tried to explain it to folks.
That was great. That led actually right into my next point. So you took it and you addressed where I was going next, which was one of the discussions we had was them saying, hey, listen, we know everything you're hitting, so you can't, because I'd offered to provide them with any information I could on what we were hitting and if that would help them at all. And they're like, no, we can see what you're hitting. Mm-hmm. What we don't know is, what are you throwing away? Yeah. So you talked about how we get all this data back. Well, I told you, we pull all those discussion posts. We don't look at the post. We don't look at the title. We literally look at who posted it, when did they post it, and that's all the information we need for all those posts. So GraphQL can provide just those two things. And I think if the query is written properly and if the server can serve it up properly, we may even be able to say, hey, give us the latest post in any discussion thread by John Smith. That's really all the information we need. So we'll now make one request when before we had to hit all of them.
Yeah.
So that's very specifically what we're trying to target. So that may be one way to handle it. The live events may be a way to handle it. We're still digging into that. I guess it shouldn't have been a surprise to me, but the realization that came to me when we were discussing it with them was they're like, yeah, we're still working on exposing it. We're still writing all the back end that we need to in order to make the GraphQL available. because I'd never touched it before, it's an obvious statement, but there's a lot of work that goes into setting up a GraphQL server.
Oh, yeah.
You've actually got to say, here's the fields you can have, and here's how they're all related. So in my mind, it was, it won't take them long to flip from API to GraphQL, but that was completely wrong.
Well, there's also the thing about rate limiting, which means restricting how much the volume that people can hit. If you give some people access to your API, and it could be a free user, so to speak, or a trial user, they could hammer your API every few seconds for stuff they don't need. So you do what you call rate limiting, which restricts them from just destroying your bandwidth and server processes. The other side is authentication authorization. Some people get a certain amount of data and other people don't. You don't want necessarily, like at the school, there's probably some data they're not supposed to have for whatever kind of data restrictions and privacy that you don't want sent over the wire. So you actually have to think about all these different pieces for authorization. And I have no idea. The one thing I don't know about GraphQL right now is how do you efficiently maintain the rate limiting and authorization needs of almost every professional API. That's what I would imagine would be a big slowdown to set that up.
Right. So that certainly, they're still working on it, and that's what I offered to provide them was, hey, what if I provide you a list of all the endpoints we hit for the API, all the data we need when we hit those endpoints? Would that help? And they're like, yes, we'll actually start to we'll set direction based on what you're asking for. Not that they're going to adhere to our whims, but that will help inform what they need to do. So it was a good conversation. Like I said, it's one that we've been in business 6 years, actually today.
Wow.
And it's not a conversation we've ever had in depth with them. And that's on me, for not reaching out and having those conversations, with them and seeing how we can help them. So I'm excited because I think there's a lot of potential there. I'm excited that we've made some ingrounds. I now have talked to the vice president of engineering. I talked to the senior architect. I've talked to a lot of the technical leadership. So at least when I send them emails now, they'll at least can put a face with a name.
So
which is always
on the tech side, what are you using to learn GraphQL for your needs?
Oh, gracious. Well, that's the part of the problem, actually, is I've started to dig in, and almost every tutorial I'm looking at starts with, here's how to set up a GraphQL server. Yeah. Well, not what I need. I don't really care. I need to work with the client. Yeah. So there are later tutorials about here's how to set up the client and here's how to use the client. But you use it against the server you just set up. So I started to poke around. GraphQL is the latest tool that's being used for as a client tool. I don't know the right terminology for it, but to process a GraphQL endpoint, I guess. And I was able to find a couple of endpoints out there to query, so I can go out and start playing with it. Because one thing they told me was, we have not announced this yet, but our GraphQL is actually up. The endpoint's there. So you can hit it and we'll provide back what we have. We don't have any introspection set up. So, or let me rephrase that. We don't have our graphical set up. So it's not going to just tell you everything we have. You have to actually write all the introspection queries. Introspection being just a query that says, okay, what data do you actually have? And it's very much a case of, okay, tell me all the tables you have, and or all the objects maybe. tell me all the objects you have. And it'll sit there and say, okay, I've got posts and I've got courses and I've got students and things like that.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, so tell me more about posts. What do you have in posts? Well, here's all the fields I have. And some of those fields will have children fields, and you kind of have to dive down one at a time. It's not self propagating, I guess is the way to put it. So that's one thing they're doing, is they're getting the graphical interface set up so that it's more self-documenting than it currently is. But it's there. So I started playing with graphical a little. And that's what I need to do next. Is now I need to get permission from one of our clients to start hitting one of their endpoints that we already hit for the API. But just tell them, hey, we're making these additional requests in order to test out the GraphQL side of this, and tell them all the protections we're putting on their data, because again, we're talking about FERPA related data. So there are protections I have to do for it. So you asked about what I'm doing. I've tried to bounce around to a few different tutorials. I'll be honest, I haven't found much that I'm ready to recommend just yet, simply because it's very GraphQL server oriented. I've looked at the GraphQL, or I guess it's Prisma site now, prisma.io. But again, it's, hey, you can now build a GraphQL server with any database. I'm like, I don't care.
To teach someone how to make requests is usually like, it all depends on how the server's set up. Like, you can show them, hey, here are the different pieces of a request to your typical GraphQL server, but ultimately you need the documentation to know how the query will be formed. And that is so variable that it's almost like there's just not much to teach until the documentation is ready on the server side. That's the problem.
Yes, but there have got to be, if there aren't now, there will certainly be people like me. I need to process a GraphQL endpoint. I don't really care about the server. So maybe that's another set of tutorials somebody that's talking right now needs to write. I don't know. Maybe as I dig into this a bit more, I'll expose all that out there as here's how I learned, here's how I did introspection in order to look at this data.
Yeah, I mean, that's I think a lot of companies are going through that kind of stuff. It's definitely worth keeping up on.
Yeah, and so that's the technology of the month. Last month was Firebase, and you got stuck with that one, and I think this month it's going to be GraphQL for me. It's
interesting. I've been working on with Firestore. We kind of mentioned before that Firebase has two different databases. They have what they call the real-time database, which is essentially a big JSON object where, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, the founders of Firebase thought, we're just going to, like, all you need are key value pairs and a big JSON object to manage your backend data. And after Google bought them, it seems like they started realizing how inefficient this was for querying and storage. And so Google went down the path of like, oh, Mongo maybe figured it out for document management better. So now they have this model of documents and collections. But there are still, I was talking to a friend the other day about what they're using on Firebase, and they basically said, I got to quit using the DB because I can't do the queries I need against it. You can't do multiple wheres, and and the indexing is difficult. And the truth is if you want to do like keyword searches with like clauses and stuff, you have to use an external search indexing, Elasticsearch, Algolia, whatever the name of it is. And in some ways, I don't know if that's bad, because even on relational databases, I learned over time that the most efficient way to have search work against a relational database is to push that search mechanism out, push it out, off
Sure.
of your app and have an external search engine. So I'm kind of caught in this, like, oh yeah, if you're just trying to get a prototype up, you must immediately set up a search engine to get search working on your Firestore app. But in the in the relational database world, you're able to get search working with Django, Rails, Node, whatever, without setting up that external search engine. But eventually in the production world, you're going to need that search engine set up. Like, anyway, it's a best practice. So it's kind of interesting that and this friend actually had not heard this line from like, he had been watching Firestore tutorials, and he's like, I didn't know that was necessary. And I remember it came up in a question Q&A video where someone said, how am I supposed to do a like search? And they're like, oh, you got to offshore that. I'm like, that should be at the forefront of the services on Firestore. I mean, of all the things that you're providing, this should be like a built-in feature, even if you charge more for it, because your database is almost useless if you can't index fields and key and strings and stuff. But yeah, so that's something that came up. Learning a lot about basically the app that I'm working on has 3 different repos now. We've got a React Native repo for our client. We've got we have a hosting repo for our React admin. We have like an admin site for the client, and that's using React, strictly like normal web-based React, and we push that up to Firebase hosting, which has worked really well. It's actually really efficient on the caching, so we've had a big issue with like not being able to see our changes up on the live site. And then we've had to use Firebase functions to kind of mitigate some of the things that, like user creation, user authentication, a few different patterns like exports, where we actually built a system that allows you to take Firestore data and export it to CSV using Firebase functions. So that's using Node and TypeScript to get that to work. And none of these solutions are very complex. I just had to kind of learn it on the fly to make them work. But when you put it all together, it's a pretty robust system with very little infrastructure. I haven't set up anything other than click a few buttons. That's the benefit of Firebase and Firestore, I think.
I was going to say that's the benefit. Is that really a benefit? Ease of setup?
Or maintenance would be the bigger setup. Not as much, but
okay. So you're saying maintenance is the big benefit. With all the pain that seems to come from Firebase, I guess that's just we're just rehashing a discussion we had a few episodes ago about Firebase. It just doesn't make sense to me. But I guess if what it provides meets your use case, then the maintenance is better than a relational, I guess.
No. Oh, well, you're talking about the DB. I'm talking about the Firebase suite of product.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
My bad.
I still would say, if you were to come to me and go, okay, what DB do you want to use for chasms right now? I'd be like, let's just go the relational route. I really don't think that our messaging is going to be hammered. Or at the very least, we'll use Firebase real-time DB for messages during the day, and then we'll archive them all to a relational database for all other needs for everything beyond. And that I could see like us having if we have to build a chat application for all of our tools to kind of congregate to, then I could see where we may want the real-time DB to be the transactional DB, and then have a relational database to be the archival data store. Uh, what's the term they use? You have transactional and what's the other one? Archival or something. I can't remember.
Sure.
This is something I learned in school, and obviously 20 years later, I have failed that class. But the idea is that you have two different types of data stores that you're typically working with. Transactional is all these different like user events and stuff are triggering data store. Like all the CRUD is happening at that moment. Your database needs to be structured a certain way for reliability and speed. Then you have a data store on the back end that needs to be geared for analytical. And so one is very normalized, the other is very denormalized, because analysis takes has a different set of needs and efficiencies than what a transactional has. So I can see using Firestore or the real-time DB for the transactional side, and then moving that data off to an analytical thing, which probably is relational or a graph type of multi-node type of DB. That being said, right now we're working with one only. And from a database standpoint, I would have been done way longer ago had I just been using relational, I think. On the overall setup, Firebase-wise, if you don't have a developer on staff, you're hiring a consultant, and you have to maintain this app over time, all of these managed solutions, Firebase, AWS, and Heroku, all of them make sense. I was talking to Megan the other day about this, and the cost of labor for a DevOps person is huge compared to the services that Heroku and Firebase, you're paying pennies on the hour for. And and I can't ever, I just can't. I know people that have set up their own infrastructure on AWS. I'm like, well, who's managing the EC2 instances? And they're like, oh, I guess we got to hire someone. I'm like, I can't believe that's even a question right now. And with Heroku, it's a dyno. Like most I do typically is hit reboot once a year because something got jammed. But I don't, like, the years go by, I don't ever think about maintenance level things. They push to me like, hey, we're upgrading your DB, we're upgrading your server structure for you. I'm like, cool. I'm going to go back to the bar while you guys do that, because I don't have to worry about that stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
And on an hourly basis, you're talking pennies to $100 an hour minimum for a quality DevOps person. And that's where I just can't get past these services are necessary for that reason, even if it's painful when you learn a new one, I would say.
Yeah, and we talked about this probably back in the very first or second episode, where that's why we still use Heroku to this day for Aspire EDU. It's a lot more economical, a lot less of a worry than having a DevOps person. Because if you have one DevOps person, you kind of need two, because what if that DevOps person leaves?
Yep. And
you got to have that backup plan in place.
The other example that I use a lot, like if you have never built a website before, or you're part of a startup that's never owned kind of a hosting arrangement, and I give you the bill from Heroku, which is on a production level $500 to $600. I've had people be like, "That's really expensive," and I'm like, "Hold on a second. I took over a company that was paying Rackspace managed solutions for us 2 servers, 2 MySQL databases, custom code on the front. They hired an India-based team to build the application out. They were paying $5,000 to $6,000 a month for the managed plan, the database storage, the bandwidth, all that. $6,000 a month, and it wasn't even working. Like, they were not getting anything done. And we put together a team that in 6 months rebuilt the code from scratch for an application that did the same thing, put it on a Heroku. It was more efficient, and it cost $600, 10 times less
Yep.
And I'm like, if you may not know what it costs to host, but I can assure you that until you get into the scale of millions of users a day, your Heroku or Engine Yard or Firebase setup will not touch the costs that you need to maintain your own custom server rack based type of deal. And it's like the where you do start to see changes is you can go out and find there's blog posts out there right now. There's one by a company called Rap Genius, and now I think it's just called Genius. And they have a post where they got hammered with Heroku costs because of the traffic they were managing and what they saw as inefficient pricing. And you can see right there, you're like, okay, this firm has hit the scale where maybe Heroku doesn't make sense anymore. But this is a company getting hammered with traffic from, not from like getting hacked or anything, but our DNS attacks. This is more of like they were just popular. They were in that category of this costs too much. But like before you get to that point, it's always more efficient to go with these like hosting solutions, Netlify's and stuff. Like, don't set up your own server anymore. That just doesn't make sense to me.
Agreed. And as a quick side note, if people haven't been to genius.com, that's a great website to just lose time in. It started as Rap Genius, which was essentially an annotation site for rap lyrics. But I've used it to help my daughter with English homework on a book. So we looked up a chapter of a book to try and figure out what the author was trying to say. And it does the same thing. It's got community annotations in there. So it's certainly a place you can lose a lot of time at. So one thing I wanted to bring about was something I also read today. Uber released to the world a framework called Fusion.js. And from what I can see, it's essentially just it's a web framework based on JavaScript. So just like Facebook released React, and Airbnb, if anyone is familiar with linting, which is the process of putting your code through a linting service to find errors and to make minor changes. The standard for JavaScript is a standard that Airbnb put out there. And now we've got Uber, who just released this open source web framework, JavaScript framework. It looks like does not look like it's a challenger for React or Redux or Vue or anything like that. It looks like it incorporates those. It looks like it's bigger than that. But really, where I wanted to get to was, is this the first? I'm struggling thinking of examples in the past where like IBM would come out and say, "Oh, we do it this way. Everybody should do it our way." Is that kind of a new phenomenon? Is it brought on by the open source era? Is it brought on by something else? The minute this came out, I was like, okay, this is interesting. And now I wonder who's going to come out next.
So let's think about, on one side of my response is there's a strategy why companies are doing this. It goes into why Facebook does React for the most part. There's also the idea of what has changed at Uber that they have joined this game of sorts. So Uber is now like they had the bro that was in charge for so long who didn't care about gender-based issues of the company. He didn't care about the safety issues for his customers. basically ran, had a very misogynistic type of environment in the company, and eventually they ran him out of town. I can't remember his name, but just look up
Yeah.
bro in charge of Uber on Google. You'll probably find him.
Travis Kalanick or something like that.
So he got booted out. They brought in a guy that had high mark. I knew people that worked at the travel company, starts with an E. What's that crap? I can't remember anything.
Expedia?
Of course, I can't remember anything. Expedia. He was the CEO of Expedia. He came over to Uber. And over the last year, he's been working to take care of the problems that existed that he inherited and get the engineering back on track, because they were losing talent like nobody else. Like, it was hard for them to hire because of the reputation of the company. They didn't really make it they couldn't hire diversely because they were an undiverse environment. And now they had all this bad press. And so my guess is that with the new leadership that comes from a quality area, they have decided, just like Facebook did, if we go out there and create the framework of the world, then we will be able to hire the best people from that world. And so that's why Facebook, in my mind, started React. Was we need the best engineers on the planet, and we don't want to have to train them. The cost to bring them into a proprietary environment where they have no idea what we're doing. And this code itself can be abstracted enough that it doesn't show our secret sauce, which is grabbing cookies and abusing that power, apparently. But we can definitely, if we educate everybody out there about, hey, this is how we build front ends, then when we want to hire more people and engineers, we've got a much bigger pool to hire from, and we can actually test them on, do you know React? Great. Are you a top developer? Great. Now prove it, because we are the ones that manage it. And so they have some great engineers at the React team, and that's why Facebook put it out there. Obviously, Facebook doesn't want to go the AWS route and the Google Firebase route, because they bought, was it Pulse or Plus or something? It was like the Firebase competitor, and they shut it down. It was like you could have all this, you could host like a static website instantly, and all of a sudden they bought it for the engineers to hire, so they got to acqui-hire that team, and then they shut it down. They're like, we don't want to provide hosting services secondhand like AWS. We don't want to compete like that. Right. So, but the strategy of building React is that they have quickly a workforce that has been trained through necessity of all these startups using React. They have the best engineers learning their tools from day one or before day one. And so my guess is going as to what's the motivation here for Uber, because God knows we don't need another framework. I don't care how great it is. Like, I can't see it. I can't see it solving new problems that other ones aren't fixing. But if they release this, if they built this in-house and they can get more people to adopt it and use it, they start to build out their recruiting, like their pool of people that, like, hey, I know Fusion. How good are, then they can say, great, you're already 20% there. Now let's prove it and then get you on board. That's what, like, I don't think it's all altruistic. Like, let's contribute back to the JavaScript world. I think it.
Oh, for sure.
I'm not saying that they're doing anything conniving. I don't feel like that Facebook is.
Right.
When we talked to Greg Pollock about Vue, the thing about Vue is that Vue is building out the entire ecosystem in the Vue world. Like, you get a router, you get the state manager, you get all these other tools that are Vue focused. On the React side, the only thing that Facebook has said that they really want is just know React well enough. We'll let the router people do their own thing. We'll let the component people do their own thing, the data Redux and all those. Like, if you can prove, we'll support the core. Everyone else build whatever the heck you want, and that's
yes and no, because they ended up hiring the creator of Redux as well. So yes, that they're saying here's the core that everybody else can plug into it. But they did go out and get the people who providing at least some of those plugins as well, because that means they know
and
React,
now they're
right?
starting to bash it. Like, it's the funniest thing is not that he was being he didn't attack it, but Andrew Clark is one of the top public developers on the React side, and he's kind of come out and said, I don't know that I think people are overusing Redux. People are using Redux for almost every state management aspect they need. And this is probably pushing it too far. You don't need Redux for all this stuff. And I'll be honest, the thing that I just learned that I didn't bring up was I'm not using Redux for anything on any of these projects. And I'm loving React way better. This whole idea is Redux, I think, is overkill. And I'm using context.
Well, they said that back when Redux came out. They said people were using Redux too much. They were using it for all their state management, when really Redux, it's for your more complicated state management, right?
But MobX is what I haven't looked at MobX, but people keep saying maybe MobX is the best way, and the people that I know have used MobX like it. I just have never looked at it. They introduced context. Which here's a common reason why you want to use Redux. Because if you set up a React app in a normal state and you need to pass data, the two instances I can think of is who is the current user, what is their role, and theme. What is the theme they chose, dark or light or something, or right to left, left to right, or they're using like a voice or screen reader or something for accessibility. How do I push to every component the state that they need to know about theme, current user, and anything else that may need to go across the whole app? And people are using Redux because they need that state kind of going everywhere instead of pushing it down through every component, because then you get this like hierarchical structure pushing the data down. And now they have context, which is efficiently a good way to push this shared data down across components instead of having to do a hierarchy and also having to do Redux, which is just a ton of code for very little event management in my experience.
Well, we won't. So first, thank you, because I had not really been able to coalesce my thoughts on why did Uber do this, and I think you pretty much nailed it. Is it's kind of a advertisement that, hey, we do cool stuff. I think that's one of the reasons Microsoft has flipped and become much more open as well. And the only thing I'll say is the way I read it. You said we don't need another JavaScript framework. Well, this seems to be at an even higher level than React. So there is no JavaScript web framework, right? Right now we have front end frameworks. We don't have a Laravel, a WordPress, Drupal. Laravel was the best because the other two are content management systems, but we don't have a framework for JavaScript that everybody's comfortable.
Yeah, that's a key. We don't have a popular one.
Popular, okay. They exist. Sales is one of them.
Yeah.
But why hasn't it taken off? I don't know.
There's a whole I should actually get one of my friends to come on because he has a big thing about why Rails on the front end doesn't work. But I don't know either. But I think it has to do with how custom the front end. I mean, the way I explain to my students, if you go into the world of React and if you go into the world of single page app, front end technology, you are now pulling back end work. You're pulling functionality that was handled by the back end, the server, and you're now pulling it onto the front end. It's now handling requests by itself. Like, it's not going to the server and going, what is this resource? What is this endpoint? It's like, it is the endpoint manager. And so now you've got a completely new world, which is almost full stack on the front end. And I don't know that it's that easy to make the server was easy, I think, because it was one request in, one request back. But now you've got this event management stuff going on and data store management on the front end. I think it's just too complex. I could be wrong, sure. But I think that's why.
No, that makes total sense. So I think there's space out there for something. Sales could be it. I don't know how Fusion compares to Sales. I'll be interested to see. I think the over under on when this is addressed by Wes Boss and Scott Talinsky on syntax is probably a month.
Yeah, right.
Because they are the ones that I go to for JavaScript. The JavaScript Jabber guys will probably address it here in the next month as well, if not sooner.
Yeah. Uber will be pushing it for sure.
Yeah. Uber's now that it's out there, they're gonna hammer this thing, and everybody's gonna be out there trying to figure out how to best use it. All right, so that we kind of hit a few different things today. Was there anything else you wanted to hit?
No, the only thing I'm going to go back to what we just talked about. Uber has to prove they're a good steward, not Stewart. Stewart's a character on a cartoon. They need to prove they're a good steward of open source. Like, I don't have any reason to say that they won't be. But when's the last time you heard about great tech? Like, I use Uber to get around town, so I don't have any problems with their technology as a user. But when is the last time you've ever heard of Uber open sourcing and contributing back to the community? And you haven't. And that's fine. There's lots of companies that don't. But if you all of a sudden want to do that, you have to prove that you're going to. Are you going to maintain this thing for many years? Are you going to improve it? Are you going to teach about it? Like, those kind of things. Like, that's what you see.
Are you open to changes? So that's part of open source too, right? Is somebody comes in and says, well, this is a better way to do this. This is literally a better way to do this. And they implement a pull request. And if Uber just lets it sit there, then that kind of tells you that this was all an advertising thing and not really a contribution.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not Fusion sounds to me like a late 90s type of tech brand. I don't know why they chose that name, because I feel like I've heard it before. Maybe Cold Fusion, that's why. Because that brings back memories of Cold Fusion, which is not a good memory, folks. Not.
No, I've got a friend who's still, that's his main language of choice.
Hey, if it pays, man, keep doing it. But when it comes to like, I've gotten some good chunks of money out of former Cold Fusion projects that have had to go to the dustbin. So yeah, like I just, Uber has, if you want to be an open source contributor at the scale that Uber is, you have to prove it. And I'm open to it.
To bring this conversation full circle, that's part of the CEO's keynote from Instructure at the conference I was at, because Canvas is an open source product. Infrastructure will sell it to you. They will sell it to you all day. But Canvas itself is an open source product. You can take it, you can clone it, you can run it, and you don't have to pay them a thing. Yeah. Now, there's a lot involved in all that, but one of the examples they showed that Instructure themselves showed was a penitentiary somewhere was using Canvas to help maintain the records of inmates for classes being given inside the penitentiary. Why is that interesting? Because there was no internet access.
Yeah.
Because you can't have the inmates on the internet. So this was an instance of Canvas running on a local network. with no internet. So that was a very interesting use there. So just to bring it full circle, Canvas has shown that they're a decent steward of the open source product that they released.
Yeah.
So yeah, I had a lot of fun out there, and this was a good discussion day. We hit a bunch of different points. So
yeah. Well, we haven't talked for a while. I mean, we've gone to this bi-weekly schedule with our podcast, and which is working great. And you were traveling, and I was doing stuff. So yeah, like we haven't had a little chit chat about tech in a while. So this was good.
Yeah. All right, very good. So I think we'll wrap up for this week, and we will see you soon.
Right, later.
Thanks for listening to This Old App. Show notes and previous episodes can be found on our website at www.thisoldapp.online. Reviews on Apple iTunes are always appreciated and help promote the show. For questions, comments, or things you would like to hear on future shows, please email us at hello@thisoldapp.online. Show music is Guns Blazing by Fab Claxton, licensed by Pond 5. Voiceover work by MeganVoices.com. You'll hear from us soon.